Welcome. This lecture is on the Union of the Canadas. The failed insurrection of 1837-1838 brought no reform, but the years that followed saw the necessary implementation of political reform, including the Union of Lower Canada and Upper Canada. After the realization of responsible government in 1848, reality demanded a viable option, a viable course of action that mitigated political differences of the English and French. That project would take much longer. With the insurrections of 1837-38, the government of Lower Canada and Upper Canada took major steps to establish law and order. In Lower Canada, the governor abolished the assembly and took control of the government. Some demanded justice and the execution of the rebels. The patriots were set free, exiled to Bermuda and Australia, or sent to the gallows. French Canadians differed on what constituted justice for those who joined the harebrained rebellion. Only a very tiny component of the population had rebelled, but there were many in sympathy with the demands of the rebels. The implications of the insurrection were particularly important for French Canadians. Some felt crushed by the power of the British. The insurrection had failed in Lower Canada, but the rebels put the British on notice that they had hard feelings for British power. However, most French Canadians were thankful that the British did not punish the whole colony. The British government viewed the insurrections as a serious issue. The fighting showed that events in Canada had reached a crisis, and a new form of government was needed to replace the old unpopular one. In 1838, John George Lambton, Earl of Durham, was chosen to find a solution to Canada's political troubles. One of the most famous men in Britain, Lord Durham, was rich and he had a stormy demeanor. But more important, he was known as a reformer, thus earning the nickname Radical Jack. To settle the Canadian difficulties, he was given practically unlimited powers. Arriving in Canada in 1838, he hosted lavish parties at a Quebec mansion where Canadian politicians presented their opinions. Yet he had advisors sent out to the countryside to gather information from ordinary French Canadians. In the summer, Durham went to Upper Canada, where he continued his fact-finding mission. After approximately 5 months in the Canadas, Lord Durham returned to England, where he produced his report called Report on the Affairs of the British North America. This was a document he wrote while crossing the ocean. The two main features of his report were that the two Canadas be united and that the Canadian people have more influence over their government. He had concluded that the major problems of the colonies were animosity between the English and French and the lack of responsible government. The rationale behind the scheme of unification was, in part, Durham's assessment of the French. He believed they were a backward people without no history and no literature. Believing that they had not achieved great things in the past, Durham gave them little credit for the building of the St. Lawrence River colony and mapping much of the continent of North America. He appeared to be blind to the racist pretensions of many of the English in Lower Canada. Politically and economically, the French did seem to be behind. Developments in England versus France may have had an impact on his thinking. In the 18th and early 19th century period, the emergence of the Industrial Revolution in Western civilization sadly resulted in incidents of ill treatment of workers. However, there were also the creation of wealth, increased social mobility, and the rise of standard of living beyond the imagination of earlier thinkers. While the fiction of Charles Dickens, William Blake, and many other 19th century writers and intellectuals revealed the horrors of industrial life, real wages quadrupled and a more varied diet and new vocations increased accordingly in Great Britain between 1800 and 1900. Infant mortality decreased significantly and life expectancy rose. There is general agreement among economic historians that material life in England improved at all levels. On the other hand, France was a troubled nation politically and economically. Durham wrote the following: I entertain no doubts as to the national character which must be given to Lower Canada. It must be that of the British Empire, that of the majority of the population of British America, that of the great race which must be predominant over the whole North American continent. It must henceforth be the first and steady purpose of the British government to establish an English population with English laws and language in this province. Durham had also listened carefully to English merchants and was swayed by their argument that the political influence of French Canadians was preventing the improvement of the Canadas. Durham desired and expected the assimilation of the French Canadians into the English. Durham never saw the full impact of his report, however. At the age of 48, he died of tuberculosis in July 1840. After Durham's report, Charles Poulett Thomson arrived in 1839 as governor. One of his first tasks was to convince Upper Canadian politicians of the wisdom of proposed union of the two colonies. In 1841, the union was official. The one colony was known as Canada East and Canada West, with one government and a capital located in Kingston. With this arrangement, East and West had the same number of members in the Assembly, 42 members in Canada East, representing Canada East, and 42 members representing Canada West. Although French Canadian reformers were angry, the French could keep its civil laws and seigneurial rights. Correspondingly important, the Roman Catholic Church received protections. However, the British did not accept the idea of responsible government. That would have to wait for another 7 years. And responsible government was an objective of reformers in both Canada East and Canada West. Instead, the colonial governors appointed by London had great power. While Thomson was able to win over most West Canada leaders, he was despised in Canada East, where the French referred to him as chicken. The French, with a population of 650,000 to the English 500,000, were upset that English was the only official language in the government. They saw the whole scheme of union as assimilationist. Indeed, the governors sent to Canada hoped for Anglicization to occur. Reformer Louis Lafontaine held large public meetings denouncing the union of the Canadas. In the early years of the 1840s, some politicians from Canada East and Canada West developed good relations with each other. West Canada reformers, such as Robert Baldwin, wanted to cooperate with LaFontaine in order that responsible government be achieved. When LaFontaine could not get elected in Canada East due to English opposition, Baldwin arranged for him to run in a safe riding in Canada West. The plan was successful, and LaFontaine returned to the Assembly. LaFontaine returned the favor when Baldwin lost in Canada West as a result of intimidation by the Orange Lodge, a political and religious fraternal society that was pro-British. Some argue that these gestures of Baldwin and LaFontaine were the beginning of Canada as a federal bicultural country. Throughout the 1840s, Tories and Reformers vied for power, the Reformers seeking responsible government, the Tories opposing. The phrase responsible government came from an earlier letter written in 1828 by Dr. William Baldwin, the father of Robert Baldwin, a key politician in the future. Dr. Baldwin urged a provincial ministry responsible to the provincial government, provincial parliament, and removable from office by His Majesty's representatives at his pleasure, and especially when they lose the confidence of the people. Canadians wanted the equivalent civil rights that citizens of Britain and America enjoyed. The day finally came when the elections of 1848 resulted in a strong majority of reformers. Responsible government was achieved that year, which meant that the Executive Council required the support of the Legislative Assembly. The coming of responsible government was a great milestone in Canada's political history. Although only property-owning males had the vote, responsible government was an important step towards political autonomy. Interestingly, responsible government came about partly due to a lessening of interest in the colonies by the British. At issue was money. Colonies were supposed to bring wealth to the mother country, but Canada cost a lot of money. 70 years earlier, economist Adam Smith had pointed out that imperialistic ventures were hardly profitable. As one Smith scholar explained, Smith did a cost-benefit analysis with actual numbers of Britain's policy of maintaining the colonies, in which he totaled up the cost to Britain and estimated that these were well above the benefits. By the 1840s, the British were less inclined to give the Canadian colonies, that is, of course, the colony of Canada East and Canada West, and the eastern colonies, Britain was less inclined to give these colonies preferential trade treatment. The repeal of the British Corn Laws in 1846 ended the privileged market in Britain for Canadian flour and grain. Other free trade measures meant that the British North American colonies had to compete with better equipped nations in world trade. Britain was adopting a free trade policy that benefited its own manufacturers, who saw the empire as only a drain on their profits. The test of responsible government came in 1849 when LaFontaine drew up a bill to pay the people of Canada East who had lost property in the rebellions of 1837. LaFontaine's bill enraged the Tories because it would award money to some who had joined or supported the insurrection. Although the governor, James Bruce, Earl of Elgin, did not like the rebellion losses bill, he signed it. Tories responded in anger and rioted in Montreal, Kingston, and Toronto. In Montreal, a mob pelted Lord Elgin with eggs and stones, And then the mob burned the Parliament building to the ground. At the time, the assembly was in session and they were forced to flee. Those behind the destruction were primarily English merchants of Montreal who felt threatened by the rise of the French. The English had lost their special place in the empire. There was serious consideration given to the idea that Canada separate from Britain and join the United States. Approximately 300 signed the annexation manifesto. Tories maintained their loyalty to the British connection, but they also believed that the government was giving in too much to the French. So it was just a minority of Tories, but still the fact that there had been 300 signatures clearly demonstrated that there was considerable anger. With responsible government, there was no end to political squabbles that often resulted in political deadlock. Canadian politicians found it difficult to agree on anything. For example, the location of the capital was hotly debated. At first, Kingston was chosen as the capital, but it proved to be too small. Montreal became the capital, but when the Parliament building was burnt down, Toronto became the capital. Eventually, the plan was that the capital would rotate between Toronto and Quebec City. The Assembly attempted to decide on a permanent site, but there was no agreement on where. When the government asked Queen Victoria to decide, she chose Ottawa. But who were the main political players of the 1850s? By the early 1850s, Robert Baldwin and Louis LaFontaine resigned from politics. Baldwin had often been at odds with other Canada West politicians, particularly Francis Hicks, a banker who favored government involvement in expansive developmental projects such as railroad construction. Soon there was a splintering of reformers. There were the moderates under Hincks and the radicals, soon to be called the Clear Grits. The Clear Grits opposed religious teaching in public schools and were against French language instruction. With their leader, George Brown, they favored representation by population rather than equal representation by section. In the 1850s, Canada West had now more people than Canada East. The government of Canada was in a mess due to many political factions. In Canada West, there were many with Tory sensibilities who opposed reformers. In Canada East, there were reformers, conservative bleu, and the Rouge. The Rouge was a small French-Canadian group which advocated the separation of church and state, and also they favored Republican ideals. The Rouge's anti-clericalism was unpopular, however, with most French Canadians. Often there were political stalemate and political inaction. As soon as one faction disagreed with the government, it withdrew its support, thus defeating the government. The situation was complicated because the factions in Canada West relied on the support of French Canadians. There were English Canadian politicians frustrated with the French Canadian politicians who appeared to control the government. The radical English who wanted to adopt representation by population realized they would never receive enough support of the French. Canada West became increasingly clear grit liberal, insisting on rep by population. Canada East increasingly French conservative or bleu, determined to resist representation by population. If Canadian politics was going to progress, this political arrangement could not continue. Thank you.